All right, welcome back, and this is the final part of the psychedelic lectures, at least the anticholinergic and the serotonergic psychedelics. All right, so now I mentioned the anticholinergics in the previous group, previous set of slides, but now let's go to the serotonin-like psychedelics. And these are the classic psychedelics, the one that people most associate with psychedelic action. Here are some common ones: psilocybin, DMT, LSD. Um, these are DMT, by the way, is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, which you might have heard of before. Psilocybin is the active ingredients in the psilocybin mushroom. Um, and each of these drugs has its own unique effect, but they do share a lot in common. And so I'm going to lump the effects of these psychedelics into these two general groupings here um, for the serotonin-like psychedelics. So let's see here. All right. So in general, they all, if taken in high enough dosage, have very intense psychological psychedelic effects. Colored lights, distorted, vivid images are common in all of these psychedelics. Sometimes the experience of those very vivid experiences can freak people out, and so they can panic under those experiences. So some people can have a bad trip, some people can have a good trip. Depends how maybe nervous you are going into this experience. This is where some of the early research, and even Timothy Leary did some, can't say it was good research, but he did some important research trying to understand how context and setting impact your experience under psychedelics. And it is a very important thing. Um, so you get these panic experiences, potentially, but many don't. But that can happen. And then you have that's a perceptual component. But then you get this what we'll call here the psychic phase. You can have a good trip or a bad trip here, where you get this major mood change, maybe feeling of overwhelming wellness or goodness and expansionness, or fear and dread. But you get this mood change. Your thinking process is very different than your typical thinking process. Time perception may be completely distorted. DMT really does that. The DMT experience can maybe last in real time only 15 minutes, but people can believe they've been in that experience for hours. Um, and so you can get potentially some psychotic episodes that last for a little, at least a component or all of the drug, with the duration of the drug effect. And you get these true hallucinations where you are seeing people, events, things, creatures that truly are not there. You're not just distorting incoming information, you are creating florid, novel hallucinations. And the psychic phase has a lot of similarities, for these drugs at least, the serotonin like drugs, with REM sleep, where you have these um, not necessarily logical, but very vivid experiential snippet story-like experiences that maybe in hindsight don't make a lot of sense, but they have very vivid imagery and components in them. All right. It is possible for someone to have a bad trip for sure. It could be this anxiety that you get from having your senses kind of overwhelmed, but also there's an emotional component where you can, at least at the psychic phase, have distressing thoughts and create distressing memories. Okay, so these are the general features, I think, of the serotonin-like psychedelics in general. Each one has their own thing, but these are some commonalities between them. All right. There's if you are interested in the nuances and the specifics and the inter-individual differences in experiences on psychedelic drugs, I highly recommend checking out Arrowwood. It is a fascinating site where it just, without judgment, just collects tons of information on psychedelic drugs, but specifically the most fascinating stuff are the self-reports of people who have ingested any, I mean, you name the drug, it's probably on there, but people, they basically describe their personal subjective experiences on every drug imaginable. So it's just interesting to see that without you, of course, going through the legal and psychological and health risk of inducing some of the strange substances these people have ingested. So highly recommend, check out arrowhead.org, interesting site. All right. So here's another interesting nuance between the serotonergic drugs, which I just talked about, like LSD and psilocybin, um, and differences within these serotonergic drugs. So I mentioned that ayahuasca and DMT and LSD and psilocybin, they're all these serotonergic acting drugs, but there are some nuanced differences. So maybe the subset of receptors or parts of the brain that are being activated by these two drugs are different and thus produce different effects. So they all induce these hallucinations, but in the LSD and psilocybin case, those taking those drugs think that these hallucinations are truly real. That 6 foot tall, I don't know, a wallaby with purple arms waving in the wind is actually a true 6 foot tall wallaby with purple arms, whatever, still waving in the wind. And so this is real, this is experienced as real. And under ayahuasca and the active ingredient drug DMT, which can be taken directly, you also have vivid hallucinations. You might see that 6 foot tall purple whatever wallaby, but you'll know it's not real. You'll actually have the sense that you are hallucinating. So you'll be able to maybe step back as a third party observer and see these hallucinations more so than you can under LSD or psilocybin. So it's an interesting difference in the subjective experience of the very similar types of hallucinations. One is where you're aware they're hallucinations, the other ones where you're just not. They are truly real, at least while you're experiencing them. All right, the neurological effects of these drugs. So how do they affect the brain? I should say neurobiological is probably better than neurological. Neurobiological effects of the classic serotonergic psychedelics. So they're serotonergic, so they affect the serotonin system, but there are many, many receptors for serotonin in the brain. In the table here, you don't have to memorize this table, but it just shows you that LSD itself doesn't activate every serotonin receptor. There are a bunch. There are even more serotonin receptors than are listed here. You have the 5-HT1, 2A, 2C, 3, 4, 5A. So here's just a subset of serotonin receptor. Here's the 2A that we often consider the major psychedelic component. But sure enough, LSD is activating the majority of them. The phenylethylamines, which are also psychedelics, they activate a different subset of these. And so there's some different effects, and that might explain why the different psychedelic effects are there. Remember that, serotonin, the psychedelic effects, it's these three receptor types here, the 1A, 2A, and 2C. There's the 1, 2, here's 2C here. These are thought to be involved in the psychedelic experience, with the 2A being the one most commonly associated with the psychedelic experience. All right, another neurobiological effect of the psychedelic drugs, and I'll bring into this all the serotonergic ones and also ketamine, is that they all increase the growth of dendritic spines. So on the dendrites, these places where the synapses connect, those get bigger over the hours and days that follow the experience. So it's very interesting. So it causes a kind of a reorganization of your connections in your brain. I'll show that more in the next slide. And they also reduce the activity of what we call the default mode network. These are a collection of brain regions that are associated with self-thinking, introspection, and when you're not doing any particular purposeful action, kind of when you're zoning out, spacing out, just thinking about yourself or whatever. This default, when your brain is in default mode, this area is decreased in activity when you're on psychedelics. It's also, well, we'll talk about it, because it's also higher in activity when you're depressed. So maybe by decreasing the activity of this network, it might reduce depression. And there is some evidence that psychedelics do reduce depression, and potentially the mechanism is by reducing activity of this default mode network, although that is still not known for sure. Okay, here's just showing what these dendritic spines are doing. Pretty neat. So these again are these little protuberances on your dendrites where the synapses form, and they essentially get bigger. You get more of them, so more potential connections between neurons, between brain regions, in the hours and days that follow the taking one of these psychedelic drugs. Whether it's a good rewiring or a bad rewiring, that depends. I mean, can't just say that creating more dendritic spines is a good thing. It depends where they're created and for what purpose and what's being reorganized. But potentially in the case of depression, it might be a good thing because there's some evidence that this dendritic, what we call remodeling, might contribute to the antidepressive effects of things like ketamine, LSD, and things like that. Okay, back to the default mode network, since I just mentioned it in the previous slide. Like I mentioned, it's this collection of interconnected brain regions that are associated with zoning out, when you're mind wandering and thinking often about your own thoughts. If you're depressed, those thoughts are usually very negative, and these kind of recurrent memories about how bad a person you are. So this self-thinking. I mean, it can be a good thing, perhaps, sometimes to zone out and rehearse and relive things. But if taken with a lot of negative emotion and negative self-thinking, you can imagine how bad it could be in a case of depression um, or so. All right, so it's an area in general when you're looking at like a functional magnetic resonance imaging, an fMRI machine. It's an area that tends to be active when you're not performing a task, when you're just waiting for another experiment or trial to start. It's interesting that the activity of this network and the connections between the functional connections between regions in this network is reduced in experienced meditators, and it's increased, like I said before, with depression. So people who are depressed have a very active network. All right, so what is this network? It's a number of brain regions. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these brain regions, but they're interesting. One is called the posterior cingulate cortex. That's this area up here. Another is the medial prefrontal cortex, an area we think is very important for short-term memory and emotional and control and goal-directed activity. And another one is the angular gyrus. I should probably know what that does, but I really don't. That area is over here. All right. So these three regions are components, and there are more components, and people argue about what's in the default mode network. And there are probably multiple networks in the default mode network. But these are some of the canonical regions. And when they're highly connected with each other, when they're activating together in concert, when you're zoning out, the strength of that can correlate to the degree you're zoning out, and in general might correlate if during daily activity, if it's always active, it might correlate with depression. All right. There's an interesting article if you want to check it out. I put the link down here. The psychedelic state induced by ayahuasca modulates the activity and connectivity in the default mode network. So if you want to look at one paper at least that's investigating this very question, check this one out. It was done by a group that's in Brazil. What's fun is I recognize one of the authors. There he is, Siddhartha Ribeiro. He's a friend of mine. I haven't talked to him for a while, but when we were in graduate school, we would meet at different scientific meetings, and we were at the big one. We both shared something in common. We both played this Brazilian gymnastic, music, dance, martial art called capoeira. Siddhartha and I both did it for a while, and we would do it at some of the together at some of these scientific conferences. Anyway, so there are always these connections. Here's an image of capoeira, and I did not look at all that athletic or that jump that high. But anyway, it's a really cool thing. So there are about 3 or 4 different groups in Tucson. If you ever want to try out capoeira, highly encouraged. All right, effects of LSD. Okay, the LSD is interesting in that it is by far the most potent in that you just need an incredibly minuscule dosage of LSD to get an incredibly deep psychological effect. The doses that you give to an individual person are measured in micrograms. Just pure, I mean, a micro is a millionth. so a millionth of a gram. And these experiences after just taking 20, 30, 40 micrograms, up to 100 micrograms, um, can last up to 12 hours. And so that's a long time for a few micrograms. So yeah, an average dose is around 50 micrograms. But a lethal dose is many, many orders of magnitude bigger than that. And that indicates that it's relatively low toxicity and that you need a heck of a lot of this stuff to die. Most drugs don't even nearly approach that. And that's why, luckily, Hoffman didn't kill himself because he just took 200 something micrograms. So he was well below the lethal limit. Okay, neurological effects. I already discussed them. Really, they're the same as I already discussed for the serotonergic psychedelics in general. It doesn't appear to be addictive at all, yeah, no, it really isn't. There is some tolerance in the short term, at least, that you need more to get the same effect. But despite that, people do not appear to be dependent on it. The negatives, well, sometimes they be negative. Flashbacks in general don't have to be negative. They can just be this spontaneous reliving of past trips. You might still see some of these hallucinations. But there's also the negative, what we'll call the negative flashbacks, but it actually has a specific name. Hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, HPPD, is this what we usually call like negative flashbacks. They're these really nightmarish reliving of very horrific hallucinations you had, or even new ones that were associated or triggered by something in the present, even though the drug is long gone. It might happen days, years after you've taken that drug. Again, these are very rare, very, very rare that these things happen, but they can happen. Okay, there's an interesting paper published not too long ago, this one here in Cell, that really had some molecular insights into why LSD creates its effects and why they last so long. And one idea is that it actually creates this lid, the receptor itself, because of the shape of the LSD molecule, it kind of creates a lid when it binds to the receptor that keeps that LSD molecule trapped in there. And because it's trapped in there, it just stays there and activates the receptor for much, much longer. And so there's a special, like a little shape-changing event that keeps it in that receptor for much longer. All right, DMT. I mentioned before, DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, but it also has been isolated, and you can take it directly, snorted, or smoked. And it's found everywhere in plants and animals. It's found in the leaves of trees in the Amazon. That's what's used in ayahuasca. It's also found naturally in your brain, but we don't know what it really does in the brain. A lot of things are found naturally in the brain, like water and fat, but we don't know what DMT does. We don't really know what it does in the brain. All right. One way it differs from LSD is that it does not act or last as long as LSD. It only lasts about 30 minutes. And so it's a very rapid effect, but subjectively people feel it feels a lot longer than that. So very rapid acting. Ayahuasca, again, its active ingredient is DMT, but this is definitely the entheogen, this drug people take to have more of a religious, spiritual, goal-directed experience to really uncover deeper things about themselves or the universe or something. And so originally Amazonian brew, a mixture of both a leaf and a vine. And there are a couple different plants that this can be produced from, but in general, the two are this, I'd probably screw up the name, but Banisteriopsis capari is a vine. That vine contains something you guys already know called MAO, monoamine oxidase, which is it's an enzyme that breaks down monoamines, and it contains actually a drug in it that blocks the monoamine oxidase. So it stops the breakdown of monoamines. And this allows, and DMT is close enough to a monoamine that it would get broken down. And so it prevents the breakdown of monoamines. And so DMT then is allowed to make it through the stomach, through the gut, and into the brain because you're blocking the monoamines. And then you have the active component, which is the Psychotria viridis, the leaf. The leaf has a ton of DMT. And so for that DMT to get into the brain, you need this vine so that it blocks the monoamines so that the DMT can slip in there. So it's just amazing that these um, ancient cultures were just lucky and just insightful enough. Just how do you know that this weird combination of this vine combined with a leaf, and you have to boil it and put it all together, just happens to be enough to allow this drug to get to the brain. And so this is just ancient drug development, and it worked. So it's interesting that it did. All right. So that's how you get the DMT effect into the brain if you take ayahuasca. It can also make you quite violently ill. I don't think DMT straight does that. And the effects last a lot longer when taking ayahuasca than if you just take straight DMT. So that it can last like 3 or 4 hours under ayahuasca versus the 30 minutes with DMT. All right. And psilocybin. Um, Psilocybin is the magic mushroom, and it's, as you can see from these chemical diagrams up here, it's shaped very much like serotonin. It has that nice pentagonal and then hexagonal structure of carbon atoms in all three cases. And when psilocybin is metabolized in your body and brain, it's produced into psilocin, which is the active component. So I guess what happens is this gets cut off here, bang, that gets wiped out, and then you get left with the psilocin. And then you get the this is the brain active component. And that's essentially what makes you trip out. It has the psychedelic effects. The metabolites of this, like psilocin and things like that, stay active in the urine. Yeah, go ahead and look at the Wenck book again to see how Vikings might have utilized this. Interesting story. And like I said before, the structure is very similar to serotonin. And the effects, I'm not going to reiterate the effects, they are somewhat similar to LSD. And also is active on the serotonin receptors. All right, that is it for part 4. And we just finished the first core part on psychedelics. All right, have a good weekend.